Political and economic change. Political change in Britain has always been characterized by its gradual nature. Gradualism, in turn, established strong traditions. This process helps to explain the transition in policy-making power from the king to Parliament. That transition may be traced to the days shortly after William the Conqueror defeated Harold II at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. In order to ensure his claims to English lands, William, a Norman, gathered support from the nobility by promising to consult them before he taxed them. This arrangement led to a gradual acceptance of a House of Lords, and as commercialism created towns and a new middle class, eventually the establishment of a House of Commons. Both were created through evolution, not revolution. Of course, there are important marker events that demonstrate the growing power of Parliament. The signing of the Magna Carta, the English Civil War, and the Glorious Revolution. But the process was gradual and set strong traditions as it developed. Despite the overall pattern of gradualism, Britain's political system has had to adjust to internal economic changes, as well as to international crises. Some sources of change have been the Industrial Revolution, imperialistic aspirations, the two world wars of the 20th century, and the economic crises of the 1970s and 2008. These events have had significant consequences for Britain's political system. Adjusting to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution that began in England during the late 18th century created two new social classes that were not accommodated under the parliamentary system: a business middle class and laborers. At first, Parliament resisted including them, thinking that it might lead to a disaster, perhaps even a revolution, like the one that France had had in 1789. However, the tradition of gradualism guided the decision to incorporate the new elements into the political system. The decision is a reflection of noblesse oblige, an extension of the elite obligations to the rest of the population. Starting in 1832, the franchise gradually broadened. Extension of voting rights and work and welfare programs. The Great Reform Act of 1832. About 300,000 more men gained the right to vote, and the House of Commons gained more power in relation to the House of Lords. The Reform Act of 1867. The electorate reached 3 million, as many working-class people were given the right to vote. The Representation of the People Act of 1884. The electorate was further expanded so that the majority of voters were working class. Women's suffrage. In 1918, another Representation of the People Act enfranchised all males and women over the age of 30 who already had the right to vote in local elections. 8,400,000 women were enfranchised. By 1928, all women 21 and over were allowed to vote. The gradual inclusion of the people in the political process meant that Marxism did not take root as it did in many other European countries, where the middle and lower classes had few political rights. During the 19th century, labor unions formed to protect workers' rights on the job. By the end of the 19th century, some basic provisions were made for social services. For example, in 1870, mandatory elementary education was put into law. From 1906 until 1914, laws were enacted providing for old age pensions. Political effects of the extension of rights to the common man. The balance of power between the House of Commons and the House of Lords changed slowly, but surely, as the new commercial elites became members of Parliament. By 1911, the House of Lords was left only with one significant power: to delay legislation. The House of Commons was clearly the dominant legislative body by the early 20th century. By then, political party membership was determined largely by class lines. The Labour Party was created in 1906 to represent the rights of the newly enfranchised working man, and the Conservative Party drew most of its members from middle-class merchants and businessmen. With the enfranchisement of the working class, a demand for welfare measures put pressure on the political system to change. Reform measures were passed by Parliament, including legislation for public education, housing, jobs, and medical care. These demands supported the creation of a new party, Labour. By the end of the World War I, Labour had pushed the Liberals into third-party status, where they have remained ever since. Labour was never Marxist, but it combined militant trade unionism with intellectual social democracy to create a pragmatic, gradualist ideology that sought to level class differences in Britain. The Trade Union Council emerged as a coalition of trade unions and became a major force in British politics. The British labour movement has always been tough and especially resentful of being treated like inferiors. That militancy carries through to today, although it has softened in recent years by party leaders Neil Kinnock, John Smith, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and Ed Miliband. Many speculate that the selection of left-leaning Jeremy Corbyn as a Labour leader in 2015 indicates a redirection of the party back to its roots, reacting to the loss of its status as an imperialist power. In contrast to World War I, when physical destruction was limited to the front lines around the trenches on the continent, the nature of warfare during World War II brought much more widespread damage to Britain. German bombing raids decimated roads, bridges, public buildings, and homes, and Britain had many war debts. Although the economic aid by the United States-sponsored Marshall Plan eventually aided economic recovery in Britain, an important price that the country paid was the loss of many of its colonies in Africa and Asia. In most cases, Britain helped the colonies prepare for independence, and as a result, retained economic and political bonds to them, which contributed to Britain's eventual economic recovery. However, because other European powers were also letting their colonies go because they could no longer afford to maintain them, World War II marks the collapse of the old imperialist order and the beginning of the global hegemony of the United States and the Soviet Union. Britain then had to adjust to its new place in world politics, and since then has had to balance its relationship with the United States against a history-ridden relationship with the European continent. This new reality has shaped British foreign policy through to the present. Collective consensus. Britain joined the Allied forces during World War II under the leadership of Winston Churchill. Churchill emphasized the importance of putting class conflicts aside for the duration of the war. Although he gained the Prime Minister's post as leader of the Conservative Party, he headed an all-party coalition government with ministers from both major parties. The primary objective was to win the war. After the war was over, the spirit of collective consensus continued until well into the 1960s, with both Labour and Conservative parties supporting the development of a modern welfare system. Before the war was over, both parties accepted the Beveridge Report, which provided for a social insurance program that made all citizens eligible for health, unemployment, pension, and other benefits. One goal of the Beveridge Report was to guarantee a subsistence income to every British citizen. In 1948, the National Health Service was created under the leadership of the Labour Party. Even when Conservatives regained control in 1950, the reforms were not repealed. Although the electorate was divided largely by social class, with 70% of working class voting Labour, and even larger percentages of middle class voting Conservative. Both parties shared a broad consensus on the necessity of the welfare state. As a result, the foundations were laid for a mixed economy, with the government directing the economy and nationalizing major industries without giving up basic principles of capitalism such as private ownership of property. Challenges to the collective consensus since 1970. During the late 20th century and early 21st centuries, Britain has experienced considerable economic and political turmoil. The era began with a serious decline in the economy, followed by a growing divide between the Labour and Conservative parties. Labour took a sharp turn to the left, endorsing a socialist economy and serving as a mouthpiece for Labour union demands. The Conservatives answered with a sharp turn to the right, advocating denationalization of industries and support for a pure market economy. During the 1990s, both parties moderated their stances, and the economy showed some signs of recovery. Economic crises of the 1970s. The collective consensus began to break apart with social and economic problems beginning in the late 1960s. Britain's economic problems included declining industrial production and international influence, which were exaggerated by the loss of colonies and the shrinking of the old empire. The impact of OPEC, Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, was devastating. The quadrupling of oil prices and the embargo by oil-producing countries caused recession, high unemployment rates, a drop in the GNP, and inflation. The economic problems led labor unions to demand higher wages, and crippling strikes, such as the coal strike of 1972-73, plagued the nation. The Labour Party lost membership, and many voters turned to the Liberals, the Conservatives, or the various nationalist parties. Many middle-class voters reacted against Labour, and the Conservatives selected Margaret Thatcher as their leader. Her very conservative stance on political and economic issues was appealing enough to sweep the Conservatives to power in 1979. Thatcherism. Margaret Thatcher blamed the weakened economy on the socialist policies set in place by the government after World War II. Her policies were further influenced by a distinct turn toward leftist politics by the Labour Party that gave a great deal of power to labour unions. In response, she privatized business and industry, cut back on social welfare programs, strengthened national defense, got tough with labor unions, and returned to market forces controls on the economy. Her policies reflect the influence of neoliberalism, a term that describes the revival of classic liberal values that support low levels of government regulation, taxation, and social expenditures, as well as the protection of individual property rights. She was Prime Minister for 11 years. Her supporters believed her to be a capable and firm Iron Lady, but her critics felt that her policies made economic problems worse, and that her personality further divided the country. Thatcher resigned from office in 1990 when other Conservative Party leaders challenged her authority. Despite the controversial nature of her leadership, her policies redirected Britain's path to the welfare state, and although her successors moderated her stances, privatization and downsizing of government have remained important trends in policymaking. The Third Way and the Big Society. After the jolts of the economic crisis of the 1970s and Margaret Thatcher's firm redirection of the political system to the right, moderation again became characteristic of political change in Britain. Thatcher's hand-picked successor, John Major, at first followed her policies, but later abolished the poll tax, reconciled with the European Union, and slowed social cutbacks and privatization. The Conservative Party retained the majority in the 1993 parliamentary elections, but only by a very slim margin. Then, in 1997, Labour's gradual return to the centre was rewarded with the election of Tony Blair, who promised to create a new Labour Party and rule in a third way, a centrist alternative to the old Labour Party on the left and the Conservative Party on the right. Tony Blair's popularity slipped sharply after he supported the United States in the Iraq War in 2003. By sending troops and publicly committing his support to U.S. President George Bush, he not only alienated other European leaders, but much of the British public as well. In 2007, Blair stepped down from his post to be replaced by the longtime cabinet member Gordon Brown, who despite his attempts to step out from the shadow of his controversial predecessor, had a great deal of trouble convincing the British public to remain loyal to the Labour Party. The economic recession of 2008 hit Britain particularly hard, making it even more difficult for Brown to maintain control of the government. By the election of 2010, the Third Way was in trouble, and challenges to Labour control of government were abundant. Although Labour went down to defeat, the Conservatives could not muster a majority, and so a coalition government was formed between the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats. The new Prime Minister, David Cameron, initiated his vision of a big society, one that is energized by grassroots volunteers and private organizations, no longer harnessed by big government. In 2015, the Conservative Party regained its majority in the House of Commons, as both the Labour Party and the Liberal Democratic Party lost a significant number of seats.